I mean, undoubtedly, this is the most important human technology of all. Like there's nothing that's, there's no recent patent, nothing, including AI, which may be a tool here, but there's nothing that's as important as our capacity to figure out how do we come together to do things collectively in ways that are highly efficient and highly impactful. And so that literally sets the outer boundaries on human accomplishment, whether that's running a Baltimore school system, whether it's putting Starship, getting a mission launched to Mars, whatever it is.
I hate bureaucracy, don't you? What if the way we manage companies, the very systems that built modern business, have now become our greatest liability? My guests today are the authors of a new book called Humanocracy. Gary Hamel is one of the world's most influential business thinkers, a visiting professor at the London Business School, and the creator or co-creator of so many management concepts you've heard about. The next time you hear someone talk to you about core competencies, that's Gary. His co-author, Michele Zanini, is his longtime collaborator at the Management Lab and himself a former McKinsey consultant. Together, they're the authors of Humanocracy, a book that makes the case for organizations built on human contribution, not bureaucratic control. In our conversation, we trace the history of management. Few people today realize how important a human invention it was. It powered railroads, global corporations, and even governments. But also why those same structures have now become liabilities. They're dangerously out of step with today's world. We also talk about how bureaucracy wastes more human potential than it uses, why engagement at work is at historic lows, and what companies can learn from the outliers who've dared to reinvent themselves. And we explore the question at the heart of humanocracy. What would it look like to build organizations designed not just for efficiency, but for adaptability, creativity, and resilience? I hope you enjoy this conversation with the authors of Humanocracy. Gary, Michele, thank you so much for making time for this.
Thank you, Eric.
So, Gary, I want to start with you because one of the things I've noticed is that people treat management ideas like they weren't invented, like they just always existed once they become broadly accepted. And they don't appreciate how much of a contribution those ideas are. And, you're obviously widely known as one of the top management thinkers and strategy thinkers in the world. And I even had forgotten that the term core competencies was one of your earliest papers. So talk about the invention of the term core competencies, a word that I think phrase most people just view as, well, it's just the thing that's always existed. We've always had core competencies, but no, it was an idea that had to be invented. Talk about that.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's one in a string of ideas that have kind of formed modern management. And, you go back to the mid-19th century and management as we know it didn't exist. And so everything we take for granted, from the divisionalized organization to brand management, pay for performance, zero-based budgeting, all the way up to kind of open innovation, these were all inventions that in different ways multiply the impact of both labor and capital and, made an enormous contribution to productivity and to better standards of living. I think it's a fact, although maybe not often recognized as such, it's a fact that without the invention of kind of so-called modern management, what we might call managerial bureaucracy, most of the scientific advances of the last 150 years would have remained, mere curiosities, right? It's not science that allows you to buy, a mobile phone for a few $100s or, fly across the Atlantic for a few $100s. That's what we learned over these many decades. And how do you bring people together to do things at scale with increasing efficiency and with greater complexity and quality? So, I've contributed a few ideas along the way. Michele and I have hopefully added to that. But I think the most important thing is to remember that this is stuff we all invented. And when it doesn't work or when it's reached its sell-by date, maybe we need to reinvent it. But if you don't understand this as the product of human invention, you may regard it as some kind of cosmological constant that we just have to live with. And that's clearly not the case.
Okay, but tell me the core competency story.
Oh, the core competency story. Well, that emerged, from the work CK and Prahlad and I were doing, I can't even remember when, I guess back in the 1980s. And at that time, we weren't so much worried about newcomers and Chinese competitors. We were worried about Japanese competitors and worried about the U.S. losing its competitiveness. And part of that was, companies thought that if you owned a brand and you were good at marketing, nothing else much mattered. And of course, our argument was, no, there are deep skills that over many years allow you to defend your position, that create value in products that you can leverage into new markets and products. And if you lose sight of those core capabilities, core competencies, and you let them erode, or worse, you kind of offshore them without thinking about it, you kind of erode the capacity of the organization to grow. So this was at a time when kind of marketing, was ascendant, and we were offshoring, outsourcing a lot of things to Japanese competitors, just the way we have more recently to Chinese firms. And we were just trying to say, like, hey, be careful here. Think about what are the deep capabilities that you need to build. And I think that idea probably has as much relevance today as it did then. You look at a company like Apple, who's been quite adamant about trying to internalize and own the critical skills that create differentiation in their products. Most recently, spending more than a decade becoming probably the world's best silicon design shop, starting from basically zero. So that was, an immense challenge. You look at today, the European and the US car industry, who basically became assemblers, realizing that BYD and Tesla have great advantages, having internalized both a lot of battery technology, but also the technology you need for smart vehicles and self-driving vehicles. So I think it's an idea that is hopefully kind of timeless. Be really clear about what drives competitive differentiation, what drives value for customers, and be a little careful before you give those skills away. And then, of course, look over the horizon and think about, well, what new skills should we be building, over the next decade or so. So that was kind of the genesis, and I think maybe it struck a chord. I'll let others judge.
Yeah, well, it certainly has. And actually, to me, the most illuminating part of that story is the fact that you felt the need to write the paper at all. Because I feel like, at least in my circles today, the idea of the value of internalizing capabilities is widely understood, and people, the outsourcing has become a bad word. And I think people are trying to recognize the cost of that previous era of thinking. But so much so that I think people today, as they're coming into business, can't even imagine why anyone thought it was a good idea in the first place. And it's interesting to me that we're kind of having a similar thing that's going on, as you say. I love that you started off in praise of management bureaucracy, because bureaucracy, is a word that most people think of negatively. And, obviously we're going to get to what should succeed bureaucracy. But I think it's very important in these, when we go through these massive transitions and shifts, to try to understand why was it a good idea? What is the benefit of bureaucracy? So talk a little bit about that. What's your view of kind of the sweep of management history? I think it's unequivocally true that billions of people are alive today thanks to the development of general management as a field. So I always say, pour one out for all the general managers, all the middle managers in history who have made this massive machine work for us that keeps us all alive. And also, how did we ever get to a place where bureaucracy was seen as a good idea? Where does it come from?
Yeah, Michele, you should riff on that.
Sure. Well, let's go back to the late 19th century, right, when most of the labor force was illiterate, where there was the first challenge of producing things at scale with discipline emerged, and there were no really good ways of doing that, where nepotism is a word from that period. You brought your nephew to the workplace, right? So a lot of useless idiosyncrasy and efficiency was kind of the norm, right? And so the idea of creating formal structures and role descriptions and processes that were applied consistently across the entire organization were all solutions, right, to the problem of creating control and efficiency at scale, right? And without that, it wouldn't have been possible, right, to have railroads that operated across the country, to have even public institutions, city governments, state governments that had budgetary accountability for how they spent money. For Sears to, operate at a massive scale, basically it's the 1920s equivalent of Amazon, right? So, of General Motors and other companies of the time to produce cars, that not only, worked, but that demonstrated over time, higher performance at lower cost, right? So the problem that bureaucracy is trying to solve is the problem of control and discipline at scale. And it does that through a specific set of elements and practices and principles, right? So bureaucracy in a way sounds, very old-fashioned, like horsepower, right? And in many ways it is, but it's also and often it gets equated with government, government bureaucracy. But it is a template, organizational template that has
technology,
several,
really.
Yeah, it's a social technology like management. It's a formulation, right? So, and the way we would define it in terms of the key features, it would be things like formal hierarchy with multiple layers, probably 7 or 10 if you're like a really large organization, where authority and compensation are true, pure correlates of rank. So the higher you are in the hierarchy, the more you get paid, and the more decision rights you have. Where resource allocation, strategy, all those big decisions kind of flow down, from the top down, where leaders get to choose who they who reports to them, where people are slotted into roles, where coordination and comes from centralization and from committees, that kind of get together and make decisions, where careers are really defined by climbing up a ladder, right? So it's really a path of promotion, and it's a zero-sum game, right? Because there are only so many slots at each level of the hierarchy, so it becomes a bit of a competition, and where literally everything that happens, is backed by some sort of rule and protocol, right? So those are kind of the way we would describe a bureaucracy. And again, it's these things did amazing things for productivity and for efficiency, and they still kind of work. But in a way, they also come with a lot of cost, a lot of baggage that has become untenable, and we can get into that. But that's sort of, we as Gary mentioned earlier, and as you mentioned also, Eric, we take pains at kind of acknowledging, in a way, the benefits of bureaucracy. And so the trick isn't just to dismantle and get rid of it, for its own sake, but rather how do you get the benefits of bureaucracy, the coordination, the control, and the efficiency without kind of paying the management tax, the bureaucratic tax?
Again, I think it's really important to understand this history, because people, again, treat management like the law of nature when many of these ideas are actually quite recent. Just to level set a bit, I mean, you mentioned General Motors, but like the idea of general incorporation, the idea that anybody should be allowed to create a for-profit company for whatever purpose without having to get a special grant of permission. I think Delaware adopted its general incorporation law, the one that most companies today are incorporated under, in 1899. So like in the grand scheme of things, like very recently. And when you mentioned General Motors, it reminded me of one of my favorite stories in Alfred Sloan's autobiography about the creation of General Motors. He tells the story, and I'm blanking on what year it was, in the 1920s, I think, the year that General Motors almost ran out of money. People say, oh, they ran out of money. They must have been like a catastrophic error. They got hacked or what? How did they run out of money? No, they just accidentally made too many cars that year and bought too many parts and did not adjust for economic conditions. And it was like a major crisis, and they had to do it. And it was like such a fascinating story, because by modern standards, it's inconceivable that something like that could happen. Like, it was just such a basic inability to do the statistics, to like just run the math of like how do we hold our managers accountable? And before the development of today's general management, people were held accountable for like, did you do better this quarter than last quarter, this year than last year? So in a rising economy, all the managers did great. Everyone did great. And when in a falling economy, everyone did bad. And they couldn't differentiate between people who had beat the forecast and people who had missed the forecast, because they didn't have the mathematical basis to make the forecast. And from that episode, and many like it, came not just the management technique of holding managers accountable to a forecast, which again we all treat like a law of nature, but also the idea that the government, in order to support this effort, had to publish reliable and accurate data, an idea that has come under attack recently. And I just feel like, and Gary, I want to get your take on this. To me, it's like we've all been living in like that episode of Star Trek where it's like the people have been living in a civilization where they've long forgotten how the machines are made. So they live in a garden of Eden, but then the machines are breaking down and no one knows what to do about it. we lived under the shield of this system for basically a century. And it's been a long time since I think people have given it much thought. And therefore people have felt comfortable hacking away at the foundations, knocking it down, attacking it, and be like, well, I guess nothing went wrong the first time we did that, so I guess it's fine. Like, how do you feel? Like, you've had such a broad sweep of your career, such a broad view of management itself. How do you feel like seeing it under attack now from people who live under its protection but don't understand its mechanics?
Yeah, I think, Michele's point, I want to emphasize that for a moment, that, this is not only history. If you define management as simply the structure, system, tools that we use to do together what we can't do alone. So if you think about it as what we know as human beings about how we aggregate, mobilize, organize resources to productive ends, whatever that end is, I mean, undoubtedly, this is the most important human technology of all. Like, there's nothing that's, there's no recent patent, nothing, including AI, which may be a tool here, but there's nothing that's as important as our capacity to figure out how do we come together to do things collectively in ways that are highly efficient and highly impactful. And so that literally sets the outer boundaries on human accomplishment, whether that's running a Baltimore school system, whether it's putting Starship, getting a mission launched to Mars, whatever it is. So even though, but as Michele was intimating there, every technology is a product of its time. And when we forget that, that's to our peril, because time changes. So in the late 19th century, the average employee is illiterate, but also, and therefore needed managers to tell them what to do. And so we kind of created this new class of super employee called a manager. And it's worth remembering that, those were very rare and valued skills at the time. That was the difference between success and not success. And so business schools, Wharton the first in 1890 something, and then Harvard and so on, business schools got created to turn out this new category of individual called a manager. And, the great Peter Drucker, the great management thinker, spent his entire career basically codifying, extolling, this new practice called management. And it is probably his best book, The Effective Executive. He uses the term manager a couple hundred times and the word leader, maybe 20 times. And so if you go back, even early in the 20th century, being a manager was like being, a data scientist or geneticist or something today. And that skill was so rare that, we ended up placing it at the center of our organization. So, a typical organization today is still 100 and some years later, an aristocracy of administrators. And if you want to have influence or impact, at some point, you have to move into a managerial role. And even though, it's pretty hard to argue that any company succeeds today because it has, incrementally better, administrators than its peers, we still celebrate these as kind of that legacy. And in a world, and I would add one more thing, the hierarchy going back into military history, the hierarchy existed primarily for one reason, and that was to enable the transfer of information, both up and down. And so in a world where information was very expensive and hard to move, the simplest way of doing that was you have 10 people report to a manager who consolidates their inputs, reports up and so on up the chain of command. And when it's time to deliver an order, the process reverses. But what happened in that environment was only the people at the top had the full picture. And therefore, it was logical for them to have all the decision rights because they're the only ones that could see the whole kind of panoptic view. Now that's no longer true. Everybody can have the same information. They can have a holographic view of the whole enterprise, what's going on. And yet we still concentrate decision authority at the top as if these people were somehow, uniquely prescient and uniquely informed, which is simply not the case. So there are so many ways in which that model has continued to exert influence over us. And, in a way that is increasingly, as Michele was saying, is increasingly out of touch with reality and in fact, dangerous. I mean, if there's one thing you can be absolutely certain of, centralized systems are not adaptable, right? They're not capable of changing as fast as the world around them. And so you look at an organization, whether it's Google or Meta, or, choose whatever, that has 8 or 9 layers in it, I can guarantee you there's no possible way for them to intercept the future. So it's literally impossible, because by the time an issue or a problem becomes big enough to capture the attention of, the people at the center, it's too late. So we're kind of living with this artifact that no longer works. And yet, we kind of haven't really committed ourselves to like changing it.
Can I just maybe add a couple of things, Eric? Because your point about the fact that we are stuck in this time warp resonates quite a bit with us. I'm a history buff, and so is Gary. So we like to go back and read what people were saying about management 50 years ago, 100 years ago. And in a way, maybe with slightly different language, what, people like Warren Bennis was saying in the 1960s, what Alvin Toffler was saying in the 70s, what even Douglas McGregor, I mean, your listeners may not be management history buffs, so forgive me for these references.
Yeah.
But even Mary Parker Follett, literally 100 years ago, my favorite management guru, they were saying exactly the kinds of things that are perceived to be avant-garde today when it comes to management. So we somehow, these ideas have been floating, but they haven't really taken root. And maybe it's something we can talk about. And so we keep kind of rediscovering these truths and doing very little about it. And in fact, I would say that it's even worse than that, because in a way, maybe it's just like a general trend in society, but I think we've become less ambitious. We've stopped dreaming about alternatives. Mm-hmm. And so instead of saying, wait, let's just radically reinvent the way we organize. So W.L. Gore, the company that makes Gore-Tex and a bunch of other amazing products, was founded in 1958 by Bill and Viv Gore. Bill Gore was, I think, an engineer at DuPont who was, really sick and tired of all this bureaucratic BS. He said, I'm going to create a company that is less of a hierarchy, more of a lattice. And, that kind of idea persists, and Gore is an amazing company. But I would say
it's
that
called a lean startup, Michele.
Lean startup, right? but that level of dreaming and ambition when it comes to reinventing organization is very scarce today. And now, like, the most we can hope for maybe is to improve the employee experience, or something, some like marginal tweak.
Yeah. Human resource. We still accepting the frame of human resources now. Let's try to make it 10% better instead of.
Yeah, let's make it 10% better. So yeah, and I shouldn't like diss our publisher, right? But they recently celebrated, Harvard Business Review celebrated 100 years of history, and so they asked a number of people to project forward and say what will management look like 100 years from now. And I'll leave it as an exercise to the listener to go and look at what the predictions are. Because to me, they're like super disheartening. They're literally, tweaks to the paradigm as opposed to anything that goes, anything beyond that. So anyway,
have you guys had this experience? I get to hang out with other business authors like on the regular, and consultants and all kinds of people. And I've gotten to meet many of my management, author heroes who are still alive, like you guys, which has been great. But like when we get people off camera, okay, and we're like at the bar after the event or whatever, and people are sitting around talking about it, I feel like there is this pervasive sense that like for all of the improvements people have written about and published, and for all the copies all these books have sold, the general practice of management has actually changed dispiritingly little in the last, and people change their time frame, but like really during the era of shareholder primacy, so like the last 50 years, it does feel like, when we tell those W.L. Gore stories, we have lots of them, and many of them are still around. We have these outlier companies that have unusual structures. W.L. Gore, IKEA, even if you've ever eaten a Hershey chocolate, you've eaten a chocolate bar produced by a company that's owned by a nonprofit foundation. And you think about like Mondragon in the Basque regions. That's an 80,000 person employee co-op, or the John Lewis Partnership. Like there are these outlier. I just named like companies that people interact with every day. Most people listening to this have a Grundfos water pump in their house. Grundfos is also 100 years old, owned by a nonprofit foundation. Anyway, these unusual models, they're all from like pre-1950. Mm-hmm. And as you get closer and closer to the modern day, you see more and more and more of this kind of conformity of thinking about what a corporation can be. So do you guys, first of all, do you have that experience? Like you're hanging out with other people and being like, what?
In fact, a project that I did some years back with one of my colleagues at London Business School, we went back over the last 100 and some years of management history, and we kind of put it on a timeline. And what really strikes you is that as a technology, management is way out on the flat part of the S curve.
Yeah.
Right. It's like the combustion engine, right? There was a time when like, wow, that was like amazing. And it brought us mobility, and we can't imagine a world where we don't have personal mobility. And hopefully that world never comes. Having said that, like now we're trying to get this thing onto a new S curve, right? And so I will say, Eric, that there's not been a fundamentally new management idea. Well, let me be a little careful. There might be one or two if I stretch, but hardly a new management idea in my lifetime.
Mm-hmm.
So the core ideas by which we run our companies have basically remained unchanged. And, it's interesting. One of the questions that we often ask when we're talking to groups that Michele and I often ask people is, if you look at this history, if you go back from theory-wide to socio-technical systems to work-life balance, group dynamics, T groups,
remember quality circles,
employee
quality
brands,
circles,
mindfulness, agile teams, inclusiveness, hybrid working, psychological safety. Like, you go down this whole bloody list and you say, what difference has this made? And by the way, many of these things were super smart and super well-intentioned, but they have made almost no difference whatever. And what you ultimately end up with, and this is kind of the core of our argument in Humanocracy, is that we are now at a point in management history where we do not need better practices. We need better paradigms and better principles.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
And so, and at the risk of being slightly academic, but I think this might be helpful to your listeners, if you think of any field of human knowledge as kind of a bit of a hierarchy, you have at the top your worldview, your paradigmatic beliefs, like, what is capitalism for? Why do organizations exist? Why do people go to work? So, and most of these things, is shareholder capitalism the best idea, right? So you have these things that are pretty much invisible, that we've inherited, that we seldom challenge. Those paradigmatic beliefs point you to certain problems and away from other problems. Exactly. So, back in the 17th century, people like John Locke started to question this idea of monarchical authority and, the authority of the state. And they started to talk about individual sovereignty, which is like a mind exploding kind of paradigm shift. But that leads you to a new problem, which is, how do you do self-government? What does it mean for people to govern themselves? So a new problem
paradigm makes it possible to conceive that question in a way.
Without a new paradigm, you never get to that problem. So Michele was saying, the problem in bureaucracy is maximizing compliance for the sake of control. And every other problem has been peripheral to that, way peripheral to that.
Way peripheral.
So the problem then leads you to certain principles. So in the case of democracy, it's one person, one vote, representative legislature, universal suffrage, and so on. The principles get enacted in processes like, how do you elect an individual, or you pass a law? Those drive everyday practices, and finally you end up with the performance of a society and organization. So our argument has been that, and by the way, almost everything that has been written for the last 50 years in management takes the paradigm, the fundamental problems, even the principles as their starting point. Right? Because our organizations are built on the principles of standardization, specialization, formalization, routinization, stratification. And so I'll tell you, Eric, when I pick up, it's why I read almost nothing in management anymore. Because if I pick up a book and it starts with those as unspoken givens, I'm going to learn absolutely nothing truly new in that.
Conclusions are forced. Once you accept the paradigm, the conclusions are forced. Absolutely.
So the analogy we sometimes use is, so why haven't all these things made a difference? Because we take these very well-intentioned ideas and we try to graft them onto this old bureaucratic rootstock, right? Or the analogy I use is like putting a tutu on a dog, hoping it will become a ballerina, and you just end up with a stupid-looking dog. And so until you go back, and Thomas Kuhn, the great scientific thinker about scientific revolutions, he was one of the first to talk about this, and he said, all scientific progress is not only a breakthrough, it's a break with. It's a break with old ways of thinking. And he also said that almost always happens, and you would know the same, studying entrepreneurship, it's the same principle, that game-changing innovation almost always comes from young people and or people who have little stake in the status quo.
That's right.
So what we're arguing, I don't want to stay up at 50,000 feet and talk about paradigms and principles, but what we would argue, and we do argue in Humanocracy, is our organization will never be fundamentally more capable than they are right now until we go back to first principles. And, that's and by the way, once you start to do that, it gets really uncomfortable because, you were talking about all these kind of outlier organizations. Well, those organizations don't have a lot of room for thousands of middle managers and monarchical CEOs and so on. And so we look at them and go like, yeah, that's interesting. Let's just move on.
Okay, well, I want to get to the principles and the paradigm in the new book, obviously, but Michele, I cannot resist. I get to talk about Mary Parker Follett so rarely. And for those, she is the absolute GOAT of management thinkers and was totally erased from history for obvious reasons. And I think all the time about this thought experiment. What if the world had treated her the way we treated Frederick Winslow Taylor? Like, we had a choice to make. Our civilization had a choice to make in 1911, go Taylor or go Follett. And we decided, let's follow this dude and let's bury this woman. Let's have her be erased. And she was so ahead of her time. I feel like it's these kinds of people that were erased that we can take inspiration from. So I just wonder if you would will you run that thought experiment for me? Like, how do you think the world would be different today? Like if we viewed the invisible leader as much of a critical, core competency of the corporation, as much as we consider controls and compliance, paint me a picture of that world if we had gone Follett instead of Taylor.
Yeah, boy, that's a good and super difficult question to answer. But just by way of background, so she was started as basically a community activist, catalyst, helping immigrants in the Boston area integrate and form communities where they could support each other. And she basically witnessed how these people that weren't very highly educated, they came from Ireland, from Italy, from other places, in the tens of thousands, were able to figure out how to solve problems together, right? In a way that didn't require a lot of hierarchy, a lot of bureaucracy. And so I think that was kind of a big part of her spur to then start to write about these things. And then she even had an amazing career as a consultant. She was working with Boston area companies who are very progressive in trying to implement some of these principles that had a lot to do with this idea of leadership as being something that is distributed, that everybody can exercise, and that, what she has this wonderful term of the law of the situation, that, depending on the context, the decision will emerge, or the decision making will emerge. It's a fluid, dynamic thing. It's not necessarily something you can circumscribe a priori to a particular person and kind of give them all the power for all kinds of issues. And she had this wonderful other quote, which is the role of a leader is to create other leaders, to multiply leadership capacity. So she saw leadership as not a zero-sum game where, it's only the EVPs and the SVPs that have it. Absolutely. And there are only so many of them in a company, but rather everybody can exercise a leadership role if we give them the tools and the information. And by the way, a lot of the companies we talk about in the book embody this kind of ethos. But had this happened, had her ideas been taken more seriously then, yeah, for sure, I think we'd probably be in a better shape now. I mean, there's a broader, if you when I get into counterfactuals, I mean, you can think about this in the context of schools and education systems, because right at the time, this idea of Frederick Winslow Taylor, scientific management, industrializing decisions, was applied to schools, to public schools, to everything, right? And so the idea was, hey, let's take these teachers are mostly women and don't know what they're doing, and let's just give the power to the superintendent and to the principal and just run everything kind of in a top-down way. And so they kind of permeated the whole of society. And there were other people, including Dewey at the time, who was, instead advocating a more of a self-managed kind of Mary Parker Follett kind of model. So I think... Right. So as a society, we we went for the command and control route. We could have gone another way. Hard to know, but I guess the point is, we have agency. We can make that decision. We're not stuck, right?
Yeah.
And even though we're 100 years late, it's better late than never.
Yeah, exactly. Well, okay. So as a way into the new paradigm, Follett one of my favorite things she used to do, it must have been so infuriating to her audience. I always try to imagine this, in 1907 or whatever this was, so early in the development of management thinking. She would go around and she would say, Mr. Roundtree, the owner of the Roundtree Chocolate Factory, is not the leader of the Roundtree Chocolate Factory. And people would be like, what are you talking about? Like, it's so crazy. It's such a crazy. They say, no, Mr. Roundtree and the people who work for him both follow the invisible leader of the common purpose of this enterprise. And she wasn't criticizing his leadership. She held him up as one of the great leaders and CEOs of his time. But like his skill was not in his ability to command and control. His skill was to instill in the complete decentralized network of the firm, although she wouldn't have used that is our modern way of talking about it, this sense of the common purpose. What is it that we need to do so that, as you say, the law of the situation, so that every person would naturally understand what the right thing to do is in any given situation and don't need to be told. And that to me that is as contemporary an idea as you will find in any management book written in the 21st century. And so to me, that's like the ultimate lead-in to what you guys are trying to do with Humanocracy, which is a book. I don't know if one of you have a copy. Hold it up. We'll put the cover obviously in the show notes and everything. It's a really good book. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I really appreciate more than just the case studies. And I want to get this practical for people, and I want to talk about the case studies, and of course the tactical stuff's really important. But to me, the thing I enjoyed the most is just to take that big swing and attempt to shift the paradigm about what is the purpose of a corporation. Why do we have managers in the first place? Maybe, just by way of getting into the book, like how would you encapsulate that new paradigm that I think Follett would have appreciated?
Before doing that, Eric, let me just take a minute though, because I think setting up this kind of tension between Taylor and Follett is healthy, but I don't think it was ever the question of do we go one direction or the other. It was the question of how do we create a synthesis. There in any large organization, you need a hell of a lot of control. If you think of what it takes, TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, to produce a chip at 3 nanometers, how many thousands of variables do you have to control within mind-blowing tolerances to be able to do that, right? So like the ability, or you think in a healthcare organization, the ability to have thousands of people, installing central lines and to do that without infection and do it in a reliable way. So I think that, and it's a really deep and subtle thing, but what happened, and maybe it's interesting to ask why or not, but obviously we moved hard towards Taylor and we kind of, as you said, forgot the rest. And I think part of that is, if you look at the people who created modern management as we know it, they were primarily accountants and engineers. And they have a particular way of knowing, right? There's a particular kind of, for them, like data means a particular thing, and knowledge means something that can be measured and calculated and so on.
Absolutely.
So there's so much that is very difficult to calculate in business that gets ignored to our peril. One of my favorite little thought experiments, since we're in that mode, is I asked people whether they could have ever imagined in their company building something that looks like an Apple store. In other words, is that the most efficient way to build retail space with all the glass and the aluminum and all this whatever, right? If you've seen, you go like, no, that's stupid. Well, but what Apple is saying is we're trying to create an emotional experience, right? The folks who started that business, they said, we want to create something that feels like a gift to the community with natural glass, Ron Johnson, the first head of retail. But there's nowhere you can quantify that in a balance sheet or P&L. So we tended to gravitate to these things that correspond to hard measures. And it's not that the other things are less important. It's just that you can't know them in the same way with the same degree of certainty. So, and so as long as management has been dominated by that kind of what you might call like the left brain, Mary Parker Follett and all that stuff gets left behind. And so I think that's still true. If you look at even how we educate, would-be managers, they end up with like, a left brain the size of a watermelon and a right brain the size of a walnut. And and a lot of consequences come from that.
For sure.
In terms of the fundamental paradigm, I'll just say one thing, and Michele can expand on this. I think if the core idea of managerial bureaucracy was how do you maximize compliance for the sake of control, the core idea of humanocracy is how do you maximize contribution for the sake of impact? Mm-hmm. And recognizing that you still need control, but I need a lot more than control. I need ingenuity and initiative and innovation and adaptability and passion and courage and all of these things that basically there are no place for those in a bureaucratic organization. And so, given the challenges we're now facing as a species, whether it's climate or food security or access to healthcare or improving educational outcomes, on and on, like, we better figure out how we build organizations that are more than simply, citadels of control, because that is not going to help you solve this next generation of problems. And, but I think that would be the core idea. And when you look at the data, which we can get into, but I'll just say this, I think it is unquestionable that the average organization wastes more human capacity than it uses. And we've become inured to that reality.
Totally. We think we've gotten absolutely used to it just because it's the way things are. Yeah.
Michele, what would you,
Well, you want to talk a little bit about that data? Because I think that for most people, that's a really shocking statement. And yet, and I've been challenged on it many times. People find it hard to believe. And we can get into the data, but of course, my retort is usually just like, okay, but before you argue with me, just take a minute and think about your actual workplace, not workplaces in general, but the workplaces you actually have been in and is it true there? And they're like, well, of course it's true in my workplace, but it can't, surely it's not true in all these other. I'm like, wait, now ask your friends. Do any of them feel like it? Like, it's so interesting. Like, we have this ideological idea that the world that we have built here must be efficient. And yet we see with our own eyes the evidence that it's not true. It's actually like funny how people will believe their ideological priors before what they've actually witnessed in their own life. So help people see that this is not just a quirk of their particular organization, but this is a pervasive phenomenon. What does the data say?
Yeah, well, maybe, we can start maybe from the individual and then try to kind of work our way to more the institutional performance. But on the individual level, one of our favorite metrics is employee engagement as it's measured by Gallup. And the data is super sad, right? Basically, 1 out of 5 people are engaged in their work. Another 15, 17% are actively disengaged. They're super disgruntled and kind of rowing against the flow. And then the rest are kind of disengaged. They're not, they show up, but they don't necessarily, strive to, be proactive or to create anything new, right? To take the lead. They're just there and doing their thing, turning the crank and so on, right? And this data has been like this bad for a long time. In fact, one of the things that we reflect on in the preface of the book, Eric, is the fact that when the book was published in 2020, at the height of the pandemic, there was this surge of optimism that the pandemic was going to lead to some sort of reset. That we finally understand how important people are in our organizations. Things are going to be different. Yeah. We're going to create a new way of working, blah, 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 right? And if you look at the data.
100% people who didn't study the last major pandemic and what happened afterwards.
Right. But, we looked at, Gallup publishes, in addition to the engagement data, they publish the underlying question that kind of feed into it. So things like, my organization cares for my well-being, or my supervisor seems to care about me as a person, or there's someone who cares about my development, or I have opportunities to learn. My mission and purpose makes my job important. Like, all those things kind of had a bit of an upsurge in like the first half of 2020. And now the numbers are worse than they were before the pandemic. So nothing changed. Right? In fact, they've gotten worse.
It's worse. It's worse. It's been a grim time.
Yeah. In a way, it's worse because people kind of maybe were expecting something to change and it actually didn't. And, the bad old ways are reasserting themselves now that maybe the labor market is not as tight and the emergency has kind of gone away. So anyway, so the engagement data, and I just gave you the US data, but it's true, and it's even worse overseas. I'm originally from Italy. Italy has like the worst engagement scores on the planet, and it's probably because of that productivity in growth is dismal as well. Which people literally don't switch their brains on at work. So anyway, so there's the engagement data, which is really bad. If you look at the corporate data, that's also bad. I mean, there's a lot of like triumphalism in the U.S. about how great our corporate.
Can I just interrupt for a moment before we go into the institutional thing? Can I just riff a little bit more on what I was setting up there? Because if you dive a little deeper into the Gallup data, what you see is that only 1 in 5 employees believe their ideas matter at work.
Mm-hmm. That's true.
Only 1 in 8 say they can influence decisions that are important to their work. And only 1 in 11 say they have the freedom to experiment with anything. And so you go like, how the hell did we end up in a place where it's okay to treat human beings as semi-programmable robots, right? And kind of my argument would be that, we need to fear AI and robotics in direct proportion to the extent we keep treating people like, they're like robots. And so a very interesting piece that was done, a piece of research done by Eurofund just before the pandemic across the EU, they were trying to understand, sorry, I tell a lie. It was done by part of OECD. They were trying to understand what determines whether people use their problem-solving skills at work.
Mm-hmm.
And what they found was it had very little to do with your role. Like, are you a software engineer? Are you a, blue collar on the front production? It had very little to do with your training. 70% came from, did you have the opportunity? Did you have the incentives, the opportunity, the space to actually try something new in your job? And it's interesting. We've spent 20 years, I've been part of that or more now, talking and writing about innovation as if innovation is just like this big magical thing. Like, innovation is just the ability of ordinary people to see a problem and like go freaking solve it. And we have, in any organization, there's literally an infinite number of worthwhile problems to solve. And the pace of any organization over time, its development, is how many of those problems are we seeing? How quickly are we solving them? How quickly are those solutions propagating across the organization?
Or even trying to solve them. I think in a lot of places,
we're not even trying to solve them.
Yeah, if you're not willing to try, you certainly won't succeed.
You won't succeed. And so the fact that we have turned off the problem-solving capability, that they do not have the discretion, they do not have the training to be problem solvers, they don't have the financial literacy to play this role, there's no upside in it for them, it not going to influence their compensation. So like, we just turn off all of these brains. And so final point about the data Michele was saying. So I had this conversation with the chairman of Gallup because I said, it's odd. You're telling us only 20% of employees are engaged, but every company I go into tells me they have 80% engagement. I said, what the hell? Like, somebody's not telling the truth here. And
That's
he said,
so
okay,
true.
Here's the reality. He said, all of the real engagement on this 5-point scale happens between 4.5 and 5.
Mm-hmm.
That's where you see extraordinary engagement. Up till then, everybody's like, yeah, well, this is probably as good as it's going to get, whatever. And so when somebody tells me they have a highly engaged organization, I'm super, super skeptical, because unless you're out there literally at that left end of the tail, you're probably no better or worse than anybody else. But I can tell you, most of your employees are there physically, maybe halfway mentally. They're not bringing their initiative, their imagination, or their passion to work. Like, we just know that. And somehow we're okay with it, which is like so much bullshit.
It's how we've gotten okay with it is wild. But like, I was just working with a company, I'll spare them the embarrassment of saying the name, where one of the employees, came to me and said, look, I want your help. I'm trying to do this innovation thing and I want to make sure my manager's on board with it, whatever. And I said, look, talk to me confidentially about it. And I promise I won't tell anybody. And they were like, no, it's fine. My manager's a really good guy. He's fine. It's no problem. So we had this. So I was like, okay, if you really want to bring your manager to the meeting, it's okay with me. So we had a meeting with the manager, and we bring other people in from the team, and I'm just asking my usual questions about what's going on. Basically, like, it reveals that this organization's culture is so bureaucratic that if anybody speaks out, deviates from the procedure, does anything that the middle managers perceive as threatening, like, it's very career limiting for you. Not only will you get a bad review, but like, all of a sudden you can't access any of the resources of the organization because the middle managers act in solidarity with each other. This is like very predictable, obvious stuff. And the manager is really upset and I can't believe this is happening. I'm going to go fix it, whatever. And this person's like begging them, please don't do that. Please don't just go like yelling at everybody, that they're going to know it came from me. And now you're just going to make it work. Anyway, so we do this whole exercise, and the person calls me back like a month later. I say, how's it going? I say, it's terrible. That same manager like gave me a bad review because I don't score well anymore on the one of our cultural attributes. One of our manager, one of the things in my rubric is that I solve problems on my own. And now I'm like a problem pointer outer. And I've pointed out all these problems, but I'm not solving. And it was like devastating for this person's career. And I'm like going to the executives of this company being like, how do you expect anybody in this organization to take innovation at all seriously if this is the consequence? We hadn't even done anything yet. Just speaking up to acknowledge the problem is enough to cause massive career damage. It was really sad and shocking episode. And it reminded me Michele, I don't know if you remember this. I don't remember when this was. I think you're the one who posted like a video from the Death Star, Star Wars, like a low-level trooper who's working on thermal exhaust port maintenance, coming to his boss to say, like, I think it's a maintenance issue with the thermal exhaust port, and it just tell that story. I just thought that was hilarious, and I was like actually having flashbacks to that video as I was hearing this person describe the real version of this story.
Yeah, well, I'm just trying to shamelessly promote the new book with some using the Star Wars Empire as the prototypical bureaucracy and having absurd vignettes like, the trooper who's in charge of maintaining this thermal exhaust port, which viewers of the original Star Wars will remember is how the Death Star got blown up, right? Because Luke was able to throw in like a little projectile and blow everything up. It was the only point of weakness. Anyway, the Star Trooper says, hey, I think there's a problem here. And he gets basically shot down by his supervisor saying, it's not your problem. We got engineers who are looking at this. Not your job. We got other people looking at it. Just focus on writing the manual and keep your head down. And that's, I got a new one, by the way, where someone is like deriding the fact that instead of having lots of entrepreneurial units inside the organization, the Empire decided to have one big monolithic entity, the Death Star, and that was a great vulnerability, and they get shot down by Darth Vader. But anyway, that's there's a lot of that. I mean, obviously that's a cartoonish version, but
but I think it's important because it never occurred to me to think about Star Wars as a management film before. But actually it comes up in really funny ways that you don't notice at the time. Like they actually have a whole extended discussion about the construction timeline of the Death Star and, the pressure that Darth Vader and then the Emperor brings to bear. You're like, no wonder it had quality problems. Like this is actually like they're embodying this top-down impulse in a way that, to me, what's remarkable about it now is that when you watch the movie, it doesn't strike you. It's like not part of the science fiction. It's like, well, that's normal. That's just, of course, that's how it would be. And it's like, it's just, we have living this paradigm so fully that it doesn't even strike us as shocking. I hope one day in the future people will watch those movies and be like, in addition to the unrealistic things about moving things with your mind and lightsabers and whatever, they also had a very unrealistic idea about how you get a large construction project completed.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, there's not a lot of psychological safety in the Empire. That's for sure.
But it's not. Is that really any worse than your typical workplace today? I think that's what's so funny about it.
I don't think so. In fact, when you talk to the Gallup people and you say, all right, how do we kind of address this problem of engagement? And by the way, they have a lot of very, very smart things to say about that. But they will tell you that 70% of the variation in engagement scores is a function of who your manager is. So like, do you really have somebody who's kind of more of a servant leader in that Mary Parker Follett mold or not? And so, one of their thoughts would be like, well, we have to get 70% of the managers to become more enlightened. And I'm going like, I don't think that's going to happen. I think maybe the problem is you have a fundamentally toxic relationship thanks to this, power asymmetry where somebody controls your work, your career, and so on. And, and people justify that saying, well, there's a lot of people just want to show up every day and they just want to go through the motions and do their job and get a paycheck. And you're like, is that true in their personal life? They want somebody else to tell them who to marry, what house to build, what car to buy, whatever. Like, no, people want agency. But totally. I think, and that's, by the way, I think one of the things that makes our book rather challenging to a lot of organizations and a lot of people inside of them, because one, we're saying like the way ahead is no longer the way ahead. Like learning to play that bureaucratic game very well, to hoard resources, to manage up, to deflect blame, to embroider data, like that game has to die. That does not create value. It's a game within a game that has to die. Well, if you've spent your whole career learning to play that game, that's a pretty hard thing to swallow. Yeah. If you say number two, as we look forward, as Peter Drucker predicted 30 years ago, as we look forward, we're going to have maybe 10% of the managers we have now, maybe 20%, but there's no logic for that particular role. And you kind of ask the question from the flip side, why does somebody need managing anyway? Only if they're incompetent, don't have enough information, or are a slacker. Well, there are other ways of solving those problems rather than building a hierarchy. So, to your point about how deeply embedded this is, and I know this is a stretch and people can forgive us if we're kind of overreaching here, I hope. But if you look at bureaucracy as this super deeply embedded, maybe the most ubiquitous social technology in the world, Whether it's a Chinese prison or whether it's a Silicon Valley, company, it's like the same principles more or less. Just the macchiato is probably better if you work for like a Silicon Valley company. The food is better. But if you start to say this is equivalent to aristocracy 200 years ago or 300 years ago, it's equivalent to slavery 200 years ago, it's equivalent to patriarchy, which we still have a lot of vestiges of that. And you say, all right, how do you change something that is so deeply socially embedded, where business schools, consulting companies, investors, regulators all take this for granted? And maybe we can come back to this, but that's the problem we're working on now. Not even so much about how does one institution make this change, which of course you can. And we have some, in the new edition, we have some amazing examples of large, immensely complex companies that have said, we're going to abandon the old paradigm. Mm-hmm. But when you kind of take that up to a social level, and we can look at the data on why we think this is now like really, really like we finally have to grasp this nettle. But yeah, it's you to take this seriously and get the right resources behind it. You have to recognize that like we don't have a choice and it's going to be hard, but it can be done.
So let's make it practical for people. Because a lot of people listening to this, they're not in necessarily a big, massive, sprawling bureaucracy. They might be trying to create a brand new company themselves, or they might be in a company where they feel they do have a lot of agency about how to do it. But most of the people I meet, who I work with every day, they are eager for a new way forward, but they don't really know how to put that intuition into words. So when they get pushback from investors or from employees who've been in the conventional system, or just, like the whole ecosystem, I call it the gravitational force of this, current way of thinking, when they encounter that gravity, they don't have the tools they need to resist the gravity. So give them some advice. If you had the chance to set up a new organization from scratch right now, what would be the kind of human principles you would want it to be based on?
The first is that you do have to recognize that you need to have a set of principles that's going to be invariant, that you're going to be loyal to, no matter what. Mm-hmm. We lay out what we think those principles are in the book, which comes from, studying a lot of post-bureaucratic organizations, and studying organizations that seem to be able to thrive no matter what the future holds. And you look at those companies and you find, number one, every employee thinks and acts like an owner. And that is not easy to create. It absolutely does not come from giving people equity. That's like, maybe it's a tiny part of it. That does not turn somebody into an owner that they have 1/2 millionth of the company, right? That's not, it needs a lot more than that. It needs agency and so on. But that's absolutely critical. A second principle is that you have to have meritocracy, that power and influence has to correlate, authority and influence has to correlate with value added and not hierarchy. Not formal hierarchy. Like you may have a hierarchy of capability on any given issue, but so we have to find ways of getting the smartest people in the right place to make the right decisions, but we cannot vest authority, in one individual across a range of issues in perpetuity or until they're fired. So meritocracy is a huge principle, and we go into great detail. Another principle is around markets. Wherever possible, I need to harness the wisdom of the crowd to get the best solutions to the surface in creating strategy or in making resource allocation. But you cannot vest critical authority for creating strategy and allocating resources in a small number of people who are likely to have their emotional equity invested in the past, right? Mark Zuckerberg sends Meta off on a, goose chase for the metaverse, $18-20 billion, right? Like that's what happens. And conversely, leaders miss entire new industries because one person is anointed strategy god. So meritocracy is an important principle. Community is an important principle where the basic operating unit has to be a relatively small performance oriented community where people trust each other, know each other, have confidence in each other, where authority is distributed in those communities, where they are doing the managing rather than somebody above them. So we go through kind of 7 principles like that and not only kind of talk about them, but outline like really specific ways of how you might start to embed that principle. But to your point, if you do not start out with a very clear set of alternate principles and some real thoughts on how you might institutionalize those, the gravitational pull, as you describe it, will absolutely pull you towards bureaucracy. There's this wonderful Mark Zuckerberg quote from 2011. where he says, we will never suffer from big company disease because we're really serious about moving fast and experimenting. And like, okay, the guy was 30 years old. He was naive as hell. And, you can believe that just by talking about something, you can make that reality happen.
I know,
but you start hiring all these people from big companies and all the consulting companies, and you end up now at Meta with 10 layers or something. And Zuckerberg says more recently, you don't want an organization where it's managers managing the people who are doing the work. But that is the inevitable result you'll get to if you don't start with a different set of principles. And at every junction, at every point, you ask yourself, how do we stay true to those principles, get the control where we need it, but don't surrender to that bureaucratic model? Because every external constituency is going to push you towards that answer.
Yeah. So how do you institutionalize your intentions?
Well, I think, you do need to search for practices that reinforce those principles and that are true to those principles. Yeah. So, for instance, I think all these companies might put these principles into practice slightly different ways, but they all have minimal hierarchy. So they might have half the number of layers, managers and administrators, right? So it's that will be one hallmark. Do you have a flat hierarchy or not? Do you have rules, a minimal amount of rules, minimal viable bureaucracy in a way, and whatever rules get created, there's a mechanism for getting rid of them or establishing them in a way that it revolves around the input of the people that are going to be applying those rules, so subjected to those rules. Do you have small disaggregated structures with lots of teams that are self-directed, each that has a P&L, or as close to a P&L as you could possibly get, as opposed to a bunch of synthetic kind of gameable KPIs that don't really give you the full control? Where, you do have mechanisms that allow different units to come together and collaborate where it makes sense, whether it's for a shared client or for a new opportunity that requires multiple pieces. That doesn't require the appointment of a czar, from the top down that says, okay, we want to be big in X market. Let's all come together. No, it's more kind of spontaneous and dynamic and fluid and bottom up, where, staff functions, we talk a lot about managers and the hierarchy, but one other big driver of bureaucracy that's like stifling and suffocating are these imperial kind of staff functions. I have lots of friends in HR and finance, so I hope no one takes this personally, but these functions, when they're centralized, they lose sight of what drives value, and their process becomes an end in itself. And so in these organizations that
instead of enabling functions.
Right, enabling functions where, in a way, in a lot of these organizations, the line can actually fire the enabling function if they're actually not enabling. There's a real accountability. It's not an internal monopoly, right? They are real business partners, and they will need to be, really held accountable for their value add. Where, leaders are expected to enable and encourage, right? Not to micromanage. And where allocation of resources is very dynamic. Gary talked about markets, and we can get into a practical example of this if you'd like, Eric. But the idea of like yearly budgets that are kind of allocated down and kind of revisited every 12 months, that has to disappear. And it's more about...
So unbearably slow. Good Lord.
Yeah. And so in all these organizations, this idea of markets, it's not just about... understanding what the crowd thinks is the most important opportunity, but also creating opportunities for resources to flow easily to where they can have the biggest impact. So it's practices like that you see across these organizations. Every organization we talk about in the book has a slightly different way of doing it, which is why ours isn't a cookie cutter kind of cut and paste.
Yeah, can't copy paste this.
But there are definitely some common elements. And so those are the hallmarks. Like if you have things like that, then you're on your way to creating an organization that is much more vital and capable.
Let's talk about the examples, because I want to talk about these outlier companies. I was just the other day, I was hanging out with a senior executive from Vanguard, the financial behemoth now. And it's their 50th anniversary. And he was telling me this story that 50 years ago when they started Vanguard, nobody thought it would work. And it has this very unusual structure where it has no outside shareholders, and it is loyal only to its own customers, which is incredible, kind of similar to REI in that way. and they had to get special relief from the SEC. They filed to the SEC for special permission to have this unusual structure. It's not the usual way, and he said basically the SEC granted it because nobody thought it would work, so it didn't bother anybody. No one thought it was possible. Anyway, I asked him, in the 50 years since Vanguard got that special relief from the SEC, has anyone else made the same application? And he looked at me like, no. No one's even, they are a perfectly competitive, efficient market where all advantages are arbitraged. Not a single person has tried to copy Vanguard or REI or any of these outlier companies. We just look at them like, oh, that's interesting. Huh, funny, outlier company. Anyway, back to normal. So I think it's really important for us to study the outliers and to say if there are so many exceptions to the rule, maybe the rule is broken. So tell me some outliers, tell me some basic outlier stories.
I would say, Eric, that, and yeah, by the way, John Bogle, founder of Vanguard, is one of the great, innovators of the 20th century. But I think it's a very familiar story because, we see the same thing with these outliers in management. You take a company like Nucor, which has outperformed its peers in the steel industry for, 4 or 5 decades. If you take Svenska Handelsbanken, Swedish-based bank across Northern Europe, outperformed the European banking industry average for 50 consecutive years, you'd expect people to go like, hey, let's lift the sheets on this and see what the hell is going on, right?
Exactly.
And I think, and I think they do. And I think here's what they miss.
Yeah.
Number one, when they look at those organizations, they look at specific practices. Oh, let's look at how they do loan approval or loan pricing at Svenska. Or let's look at the technology Nucor is using in their mini mills and see what. And what you see in any of these companies, if they've been there for 30 or 40 or 50 years, as some of them have, you see this complex fabric of practices and principles that have been woven together through years of experimentation and trial and error. And you try to pull a thread out of that looks interesting to you. And then you take it. Let me give an example.
A unified system. Yeah.
Yeah. If you take Agile as an idea, all the enthusiasm 7, 8, 9 years ago at Agile. So everybody goes out and, they say, hey, get me one of those Agile things, right? Like I want that thing. And we know all the companies that did that. So fine, you do it. And then you come back 5 or 10 years later, the language is still gone. The spirit is dead. And so number one, they're not willing. And it's back to our earlier point about thinking about paradigms and principles. Their minds just never go there. All they want to know is give me the details, show me the how. In fact, I had a very interesting argument many, many years ago when I wrote a book about Morningstar, highly decentralized, a company without the largest tomato processor in the world that has no managers at all. And I wrote a piece for Harvard Business Review about this, and I wanted to put in a piece about where this model came from. And it came from a guy named Chris Rufer, then and now the president, not the CEO, the president of the company. And he was a libertarian who had this deep, abiding belief in the power of human freedom. And he said, I want to build a company that maximizes human freedom. Well, I wrote a whole little section on that. They said, the editor said, Gary, this isn't important. Nobody wants to know about the principles. Just tell us how it works. And I said, if you will never get here if you don't start with the right principles, right? And so that's the first mistake is you look at practices and you don't ask well, how the hell did they ever get there? Because the real loyalty, maybe one other point there. I don't know of many companies, and Eric, you have a lot of experience here, but I don't know many companies who'd say we'd be content to have products or a business model that is completely identical to our competitors. At least you hope they finally gotten the message.
Nobody is ever willing to admit that. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I mean, they may, but at least they say,
but that's not no one ever has that aspiration. And certainly not at the beginning. People find that idea.
But everybody seems to be happy to have a management model that's the same as everybody else's. And what happens is these young companies, they go to Workday, they go to SAP, they start installing all these systems that are built on those old principles and will perpetuate them. And what they don't want to do is the hard work of imagining an alternative. So what's interesting, if you look at all the companies that we talk about in the book, in healthcare, in industrial products, in financial services, countries all over the world, everyone has deeply distinctive management processes, all built on the same principles and the same ultimate challenge, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And so if what you want is plug and play, well, you're already asking the wrong question because
you're asking a question driven from that old paradigm. So the very question you're asking reveals your inability to grasp the new thing.
Because here's an interesting factoid from a lot of our research. So we look back over more than 100 years, 800 years of industrial and military history. And the question was, why do some armies, navies, and so on, no air forces that long ago, why did they enjoy long periods of superiority? And what you find is that it almost never came from technology. It never came from great generals. It never came from a brilliant battle plan. It came from organizational innovations like meritocratic selection of officers in the Prussian army. The Dutch were the first to understand how do you do drill and move armies in sequence very rapidly. The British invention of the regimental structure, right? And
totally.
so
Culminating in maneuver warfare.
And yet we don't even, when you use the word innovation in a typical company, they don't even think about innovation in that domain.
Yeah. No, it's a very limited mindset about what even is possible. And I can say in Silicon Valley, the conventional advice is that, and this is how people put it, I try to steel man the argument as best I can, which is like, you're doing something new in your product, in your culture or whatever. You're already taking so much risk in that innovation. You can't afford to add extra risk by innovating in your corporate structure, management philosophy, OKR system, whatever. So you should make that stuff as conventional as possible so that you can maximize the energy you spend making your product unconventional and differentiated, as if these are independent variables that you can choose to be completely conventional over here and be completely unconventional over there. So blow this advice out. I've been given that advice more times than I can count. And it's if you look at some of the hottest private companies, when those CEOs who are very visionary and quite bold, when they're interviewed and asked, how come you're not doing, this or that practice, they always retreat to that advice as if it was a best practice. So what's wrong with that idea?
I was talking to the former head of innovation at Tesla, and I said, I had my hypothesis. In fact, I have a way of saying this, but I asked them, like, why are you guys moving so fast? Like, and same for SpaceX. Why have you just moved faster than all of your rivals?
Yeah.
And he said, because we have a very high ratio of doers to talkers, or what we would call makers to managers, right? We just have and Michele's collected some very interesting data on this. But yeah, they don't think about, we need a management model that's as innovative as our product model. And I'll tell you what a lot of these young companies forget in Silicon Valley, and I've lived there now for more than 30 years. They think they're winning because they have a great business idea. That is seldom the case. Business ideas are not that rare. You can generate a lot of them really fast today. The reason they win is largely because of an organizational advantage. They have very little hierarchy. People naturally migrate to where they can add value. They can pivot very, very quickly. There's no room for mediocrity. Anybody who's out not performing gets quickly turfed out. You have transparency at every role. You can put an all hands meeting and suddenly have everybody on the same page. So they're open, fast, flat, free, and whatever. And you come back 10 years later, all that's gone. And so often they are believing their advantage. They are misattributing their real advantage, I would argue.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and it's interesting because I was just looking at this data that Harvard Law School did this study. I think it was Harvard Law School that was looking at 18,000 startups. They did a longitudinal study of 18,000 startups. And in the popular imagination, the founder CEO who has total control, the Elon, the Zuckerberg, like those people loom very large in the public imagination as that's what it means to be a founder CEO. But in the data, you don't even realize how exceptionally rare that is. And in this longitudinal study, by the time companies had gone public, and I think it was like 3 years later, only 0.4% of the founder CEOs were still in control of the company. And everyone I meet is just absolutely convinced they're going to be in the 0.4%. So they don't feel the need to take protections seriously, and they're surrounded by bankers and lawyers and advisors who tell them, Eric's such a downer. He's warning you about stuff that's not going to happen to you. If he really believed you were such a visionary, he would be giving you this data. So like it's like, to me, they're like, it's like, teenagers being told that they can't die. So here are the key bars and drink all you want. It's like, once you become believed, like when your ego becomes identified with the idea that because of your unique vision, you're invincible, there's no need to take precautions. There's no need to invest in that stuff. And then I've been at this long enough, not as long as you, but long enough certainly to have seen like generation after generation of founders who are betrayed, who lose control of their company, who want having to sell it to a bigger thing, and then they get rich and miserable, or they stay in the role, but the thing becomes like a zombie. It becomes unrecognizable to their original intention. And now we're seeing this massive mental health crisis among all these founders who are out there on social media going crazy, like decohering in front of our eyes. And a lot of them are rich beyond belief, but the compromises that were necessary to do that are really painful. So
Well,
I guess
in a top-down organization, we ask too much of too few. And
yeah.
the problem is that the few are often find it hard to admit that they're not up to that.
It's an Atlas Shrugged kind of situation where you're being asked to bear the weight of this. You're the one person standing between the organization and corruption. And it's for most people, it's too much. And even for the people that have the ability to bear, it takes a tremendous emotional and spiritual cost that is unnecessary if we build organizations that are designed to share that load. So we'll give them advice, like talk directly now to a founder who's in that situation or is going to be. How would you advise them to like find a different path that is both better for them and most importantly is better for their organization, lead to better outcomes in the end?
Well, Michele, let me give you a chance to think about some specific advice. Let me give a more generic piece of advice. I think you start with humility. And you start with the idea that genuine longevity is not going to depend on your brilliance. Genuine longevity for your organization is going to depend on creating an organization where you can harness the best minds every day, even when they disagree with you. Somebody once said about the United States, you could say this about any constitutional democracy, but they said America was invented by geniuses to be run by idiots. And they're always idiots, like whatever side they are. They have their peccadillos and their whatever. And the resilience of the United States depends only fractionally on who's in the White House. It's our capacity to start new businesses, redeploy resources, welcome immigrants and so on and so on. And yet, we design our companies like almost the reverse. Like our companies seem like they were designed by idiots, can only be run by geniuses. So I think that's the first thing. As a CEO, recognize you are not the strategist in chief. You are not the chief product officer. Your primary, and if you look at all the examples that we talk about, whether it's Birdsargan Healthcare or Back to Gore or Hire and so on, or Nucor, all the CEOs at the very start saw their primary job as building an organization that unleashed human capacity consistently in brilliant ways, and everything had to support that. And they saw themselves not as decision maker in chief, not as strategist in chief. They saw them as an architect. Let me give you an example. If you look at Linus Torvalds, right, like programmer par excellence, his contribution was not being the smartest programmer in Linux. He was a very smart programmer. His first contribution was thinking about, how do I create a collaborative infrastructure where thousands of people can come together to co-create? So the most used software in the world, 25 million lines of code that is created with no bureaucracy and no formal management structure. There's an informal, but nothing really formal. And then his next great act was to create GitHub. Right now with 2 billion contributions and 100 million projects in the way of the world. And he said, I'm not going to be the guy who created this brilliant LLM, this brilliant, whatever it is now, this brilliant thing. I'm the guy who thinks about, how do I create the architecture that allows people to do extraordinary things? That is the role of a CEO. And if a young CEO doesn't quickly shift in that role, you are living on borrowed time even from the start.
Tim O'Reilly, who we had on a previous episode, has this advice I've always found so helpful, which is just to worry about creating more value than you capture. And it's like a simple way of embracing the idea that if you create a lot of positive externalities in the world, like that will eventually come back to you. You don't need to be so concerned and so worried about how to squeeze every last drop of it out of it for yourself. And the people I admire the most are the entrepreneurs who have not just created great companies, but have created what I call civic infrastructure. And Linus is such a great example where, like, how many hundreds of billions of dollars of value has Git and Linux created in the world? Like uncountable. Even if you just count the value cap of the market cap of just the companies that are directly using those technologies as their primary business, GitLab, GitHub, all the Linux companies. Yeah, it's an incredible amount of value. Now, I'm sure he's done perfectly well for himself also, but you can't unlock those opportunities if you're myopically focused on, what's going to be in it for me. You have to be willing to trust that if you create positive externalities, it's going to work out. And through that mechanism, you see these occasional outlier brilliant things, whether we're talking about Wikipedia or, we had Craig Newmark on and talked about Craigslist. Craigslist is such an unlikely story. Again, something we all take for granted is, of course, it's a Craigslist, but actually like a tremendous positive externality in the world that he didn't make any effort to try to maximize the amount of value he would capture from it. And as a result, seems like a very well-adjusted and happy person, knowing that he created this infrastructure for the world. Not like he didn't get rich. It's been really good, but he didn't feel the need to squeeze every ounce out. Whereas the people who have gotten those obscene levels of wealth, who have been like really focused on like on secrecy, on paranoia, on control, it does occasionally work out, but it seems like even when it works out, quote unquote, it has this tremendous cost. So talk a little bit about, are there companies in your research that you've encountered that you would put in that even higher plane of accomplishment, where it's not just that they've been successful and profitable, it's not just that they have a humane, management system that they've been able to endure, but they really have like achieved almost a civic status of creating like such value in the world that you admire them on that basis?
As just we talk about the founder, what can they do? I think the first, and we talked a little bit about this, is to be open to radical alternatives, right? Be skeptical of received wisdom that, there's a grown up way of managing a company, because there might be, but, or maybe companies you can benchmark, but what if everybody sucks, right? I mean, it's kind of our, and so you need to almost be as open, to alternatives to the bureaucratic status quo as, Netflix is the BBC or ChatGPT is from like old Google, right? And so just, kind of just as you think about breaking orthodoxy, or questioning orthodoxy when it comes to your products or services or markets, do the same thing when it comes to received wisdom about how you manage. That'll be number one. Number two, related to that, is consider the organization as in a way another product that you're innovating. Right, as Gary mentioned earlier, you mentioned it as well. It's a source of advantage. In a way, it's even in the innovation stack. It's even more fundamental than the product and the business model. And the way you innovate is through experiments, right? And figuring out a new way of doing resource allocation, or evaluating people, or moving resources around, or setting plans, and involve other people in discovering a new way of making those kinds of decisions. And then the last thing for me is, just related to this is, don't think that you by yourself can create the culture. I mean, yes, you can. The way you role model and the way you act, certainly that can make a big difference, but it doesn't necessarily scale. And even if it does scale, it won't necessarily endure, right? I mean, if you leave, or if the company gets taken over, then other kind of mindsets, behaviors will emerge. And so to me, the culture, it's one of those words that, it's the triggering word for me, we have a great culture. What does that actually mean, right? And to me, it's the product of specific choices you make about how you manage, organize, and lead. And so it's something that you need to work hard at and institutionalize. Otherwise, it'll be very kind of brittle, or it won't necessarily stick. So those would be, three pieces of advice for founders.
I think this question of what's the ultimate purpose of an organization, of business, that you were asking there, Eric, what's like the ultimate civic value? I think it's a super important question. And I think there's been a lot of very muddy thinking about that. We've had all of this stuff over the last few years of, B Corps and, what's the higher purpose and so on. And yet, if I go back and look at almost any great company historically, they were in the thrall of some great purpose. Henry Ford wanted to create mobility. Like, do you have something better in mind than that? Like, I'd like to hear what it is, right? The Watsons at IBM said, we have this amazing new technology that we can harness to, give everybody access to data and have well-informed decisions. Well, that's like a pretty important thing. AT&T said, we're going to connect everybody. I remember working when Nokia was barely getting into the cellular business. And I remember, I think there were 500,000 cellular subscribers in the world at the time. And I said, let's go for 1 billion. Because clearly people want to communicate. If you give them the tools, they're going to do it. And so I think, yes, if your only purpose is to make money, that's a problem. Having said that, I'm a huge fan of shareholders. There's a reason the shareholder movement took off. Because if you go back historically, there were many, many companies, and it still are, that are run for the benefit of the managers. In fact, even today, Eric, there is zero correlation between CEO compensation and shareholder returns.
Yeah.
So now I think the mistake comes, and this is where you'll see the companies we talk about don't fall into this mistake. The mistake comes when you mistake the scoreboard for the game. If you're not producing positive shareholder returns, you are wasting society's resources. You deserve to go out of business, full stop. Having said that, the companies I think are enlightened will tell you employees come first, at least if you're a leader, because if you don't take care of them, your customers are not going to. Employees come first, then customers, and shareholders are the residual claimants. If you reverse that, then you get all this crazy crap where, you have short-term compensation systems and you're paying CEOs vast sums of money for buying back their own shares, which sometimes is a good thing to do, but shouldn't influence your compensation. And so I think, I think any business that's going to endure, the way I think about it is, are you solving a really important problem? Like, you better have that front and center. So when Starling says, how do you give everybody in the world access to the internet? Like, there are not many problems that are interesting or bigger than that, I think, to solve. And so do they need some social purpose above that? I don't know, maybe, but I think that's probably like good enough. So the other thing I would say is, around the world right now, capitalism has a huge branding problem. And when you look at the surveys, it's amazing to believe, but a majority of people around the world think capitalism does more harm than good. Now, I think that's bullshit. I think that's a feeling. I don't think that is actually true. It's market mechanisms that have lifted billions of people out of poverty. It is not central planning. And yet the reality today is there are way too few people who are benefiting from capitalism.
Yeah.
So, you look at the United States over the last 20, 30 years, we created about $130 billion of new wealth, all these multi-trillion-dollar companies. And all of that wealth, all of it went to the top half of households, all of it.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting when you look at what's happening at Haier in China, or you look at what's happening in another company we talk about, Ingersoll Rand, a 100-year-old manufacturing company. What they are doing is they're training frontline people to be business people, blue collar employees. They're teaching them about, cash flow and strategy and disruptive technology. And they're giving them billions of dollars of millions of dollars of equity. And they're giving them an upside when they solve problems. And so, Michele and I wrote a piece a while back that the real problem with capitalism is we don't have enough capitalists. Right? Everybody should be able to participate in this. And when you have organizations where only the shares are only going to the top 20 or 30 executives, that's just like, no, that's just like wrong.
Yeah. No, in the long term, it's self-defeating.
It's self-defeating. And, we risk killing the golden goose if we don't make sure that everybody gets their share of this.
Yeah.
So Eric,
oh, good.
Okay. Sorry.
No, I want to be respectful of your guys' time. Do you have a minute to wrap up here, or do you?
Yeah. Do you still? I wanted to share maybe a couple of. Do you want a couple quick cases of like companies that have risen to this kind of level?
Yeah, that'd be
my
great.
personal favorite. So one is Buurtzorg. They're the largest provider of home health services in the Netherlands. And they started with a team. So they started as a lean startup with like 6 nurses. They're founded by this remarkable person, nurse himself, Jos de Blok, who basically said, I want to go back to the way we used to do nursing and helping people in their homes that were recovering from surgeries or were like needed long-term care or were needed palliative care because they were in the process of passing. And he said, that whole healthcare system had become so bureaucratized, so dehumanized. I want to create something new. So this is in the public kind of nonprofit sector, and now, that team went from, 1 to now it's 1,000 team. They have about 10,000 nurses. These nurses, operate in small teams. And we kind of, according to the principles and practice we mentioned before, they are autonomous. They're accountable for their own economics. They manage themselves. They don't have a supervisor. And yet it's like an incredibly efficient organization. They're by far the most efficient provider of home health services in the country. And what's remarkable about Buurtzorg is that they ended up, their success was so important that they ended up changing the way that billing and regulation happen for these kinds of services. And so the whole sector of home health care provision changed emulate their model. So they not only delivered amazing value to their own patients, but they changed the entire sector. And now they're trying to do that in other countries. So to me, that's a remarkable model. Yeah, zero managers. So basically, they have I think 50 people. Yeah, 10,000 people. They have 100 people at head office, and it's like super flat. So Bertzberg is amazing. Yeah, and then very, very quickly, Gary mentioned Nucor. They're the largest steel maker in the Western Hemisphere, certainly the most profitable. They've been running this amazing model that was instilled by, in a way, their de facto founder, Ken Iverson, who basically said, again, starting with a principle saying, the genius of the organization isn't at the center, it's at the periphery. It's at the edge of the organization. So I'm going to create a company that, this is a public company, right? So public, the shareholders, but the whole company was based on this idea that we want to elevate and empower the front lines. So they, again, a little bit like Bertzberg and some of the other examples, they have very small teams that are self-managing with real skin in the game, with a lot of training and information to make smart decisions. And, they've never, this is a very cyclical industry, steelmaking, with lots of up and downs. They've never done layoffs. I mean, if you're in a company, you get fired, but they've never, there's a social contract within the company where if you do your job well, you'll have it tomorrow, right? And in case of a downturn, what they do is they reduce not the workforce, but the work week. Right? And investors, by the way, are totally cool with that because they understand that that's sort of like what drives their performance, that ingenuity, that intellect, that loyalty. And one of the things that I'll never forget, and I was visiting one of their mills in Arkansas, and one of the maintenance managers said, what we do is, our people make steel for sure, but our job is to make people and build people, and then people build communities. And so I think it's a very interesting story of how you can reconcile the profit motive and this kind of community impact in as a public company, which some people think it's not possible, but it's starting with that different principle, right? Anyway, so those are just two quick vignettes.
Let me go back up to the macro for one moment, to put maybe all of this conversation a little bit in context, and why we're care about this a lot and why we're quite passionate about it. Eric, if you look over the last 25 or 30 years, we've seen steadily declining productivity growth across almost all of the major economies. So from back at the turn of the millennium, productivity growth was close to 3% per annum. Now it's barely 1% per annum. And that has huge implications for our ability as societies to fund healthcare, education, defense. It exacerbates income inequality. It flattens out wages and so on. And, the people around the world who are worried about populism, this is why it's happening. You have huge shareholder wealth, and yet we have also declining productivity. And what's interesting, and if you just bear with me for a moment, when you unpack, just a little bit of data here, if you divide the last 60 years into two 30-year segments, for the first 30 years, 1960 to 1990, roughly, profits of American corporations grew at 2% a year. Over the last 30 years, that grew at almost 5% a year. And you go like, what the hell? Is that technology? Is it better leaders? Is it better strategy? No, it is all exogenous external factors. Record low interest rates, cutting corporate tax rates in half, wage arbitrage, principally because of China, and increasing consolidation that has allowed companies to more than double their markups. And this is all empirical data. There's no speculation. And so, in fact, if you take those external factors away, American companies over the last 30 years would have had lower profit growth than they did over 30 years. So the fact that CEO salaries have gone like this, we are paying skippers for the wind. No question, right? Now, the dilemma is if productivity continues to decline, we're going to have more social pressure, less to fund social priorities. And we think it is not a coincidence, Eric, that as bureaucracy has gone like this, productivity has gone the other way.
Yeah,
so since the early 1980s, the number of administrators and managers in the U.S. workforce has grown by about 150%, and all other jobs by less than 50%. So we're creating managerial and administrative jobs at 3 times the rate of all other jobs. This was exactly what is happening in the public sector as well. We have all the data on this, highly granular. And of course, what Elon Musk learned was that you don't solve obesity with an amputation, right? I mean, what we had to do is we definitely have to reduce the weight of that bureaucratic, because it is undermining entrepreneurship and resilience and vitality in these organizations. So we believe that if we want to restore the American dream, if we want to restore productivity growth across Europe and so on, we have to get rid of the bureaucratic model. There's things in it that make it self-perpetuating, even as it slowly strangles these organizations. And so for an individual firm, there's a competitive logic. You need to be faster and better and more innovative and better at solving problems. But at a societal level, we can no longer afford to have this ever-expanding bureaucratic morass that's sucking up energy and initiative and so on and undermining productivity growth. So that's kind of the challenge we're working on, like right now, is how to revitalize the entire economy and beyond. But like for this to happen, it's not, I would say, I do not like the term minimal viable bureaucracy. Bureaucracy has to die, right? There's no minimum viable cancer, right? We want cellular division, right? We want a healthy cellular division, but cancer is not cellular division. So that's kind of the meta level challenge. And we are doing a lot of thinking about how to tackle it at that level. But at an individual company, you got to have the courage, as for example, at Roche, the second largest pharma company in the world, you know, they had the courage, their CEO at the time had the courage to say, we're going to tear the organization back to the studs. And that I have to admit that something is wrong with the entire system. That's like a super hard thing to say, right? What I want to say is, hey, there's this thing here that needs to be fixed. I'm going to give it to an EVP. They're going to talk to the consultants, and we're going to have a check-in in 90 days, and I'll figure out how it's going on, right? Yeah. You got to say, no, we got to change the system. The good news, and we lay it out in the book, is you can do it one step at a time without blowing things up, right? This is not like we talk about revolutionary goals and evolutionary steps. So it's possible. You're not going to blow things up. You're not going to have an earnings crisis. And we have plenty of examples of large complex that have made this transition. It's possible, but you got to get to the point where say like, you know, this is like quality, or it's like, you know, like we just can't ignore it. We're just going to have to do it. Suck it up.
All right. Well, as with so many things in the field of management in the past few decades, Gary, you get the final word. Thank you very much for having this conversation, both of you taking the time. And just, I thank you for your advocacy for these human values. I'm, encourage everybody to check out the book. It's really awesome. Really like the new edition, and the new examples that are added are really good. And I appreciate you ending on this note of social urgency, because as a society, we better get these issues fixed, or we're going to have, if people think we're in turbulent, difficult times now, imagine if this trend continues. So thanks also for the advocacy and the work that you're doing to try to think at a bigger systems level. And please consider me an ally going forward. Yeah,
thanks for your work as well, Eric. It's been hugely impactful, and we've drawn a lot of inspiration from that as well.
Oh, thank you for saying so. I appreciate it. You've been listening to The Eric Ries Show. The Eric Ries Show is produced by Jordan Bornstein and Kiki Garthwaite. Research by Tom White and Melanie Rehack. Visual design by Reform Collective. Title theme by DB Music. I'm your host, Eric Ries. Thanks for listening and watching. See you next time.